U.S. Surgeon General Dr. Vivek Murthy has issued warnings regarding the influence of social media on today's youth. What research is necessary to deepen our understanding of the relationship between social media use and mental health outcomes? How can clinicians provide guidance in the digital age as additional research emerges? I'm Dr. Kirsten Bibbins Domingo, and I'm the editor in chief of JAMA and the JAMA Network. Welcome to part 2 of our interview with Dr. Vivek Murthy, Surgeon General of the United States. In this part, we'll discuss his leadership in addressing youth mental health amidst social media's influence. Dr. Murthy's recent advisory report highlights the impact of digital platforms on young minds and proposes strategies for risk reduction. Dr. Murthy, thanks for joining me.
Thanks so much, Kirsten. I'm glad to join you today.
So, Vivek, when I think of Surgeon General warning labels, I think of tobacco. Now you're issuing one for social media. What is it that made the Surgeon General issue warning labels for social media at this time?
Well, Kirsten, one of the first issues I started hearing about during my second term as Surgeon General was about social media. And this was coming from parents in particular. And the most common question they were asking me was, is social media safe for my kids? And behind that question was a worry that it wasn't, because they were seeing what was happening to their kids, in terms of how it was impacting their sleep and their learning. They were seeing how it impacted their self-esteem. They were seeing at times their kids bullied and harassed online and wondering, are you sure this is okay? At the same time, parents would often say to me, if it's out there and if it's free and available for my kids to use, it must be safe, right? Somebody must have checked it out and made sure it was okay. So that is actually what prompted me to go on this journey. And the first pit stop there was actually after the conversations to issue a Surgeon General's advisory last year on social media and youth mental health. And there are two really important things that came from that ultimately led to this recent announcement about a warning label. The first was the answer to the parents' question about, hey, is this safe for my kids? There actually wasn't enough data for us to say with confidence that social media was safe for kids. The second thing that we were finding is that there was actually increasing evidence of harm. And that evidence was coming through multiple channels. One, in the data, we were seeing an association between social media use and youth mental health harms. Now, there's some debate, an important debate in the scientific community about what is the size of that association? What is the significance of that association? Is it greater in some subgroups than others? And it certainly does look like it is greater among girls than boys, for example, when you're looking at adolescents. That be as it may, the association was there in multiple studies. What we were also seeing were data points that told us, for example, that adolescents using social media 3 hours or more a day, that was associated with a doubling of risk of anxiety and depression symptoms. But what was also interesting, Kirsten, was the data that was coming from young people themselves, right? So we had survey data, other measures that were telling us that young people were actually concerned about the harms of social media. It didn't mean that they didn't acknowledge some benefits. They did. But they also knew that there were harms. So nearly half of adolescents were saying on surveys that social media use made them feel worse about their body image. A third of adolescents were saying they felt addicted to social media. A third were saying that they were staying up till past midnight or later on school nights, and using their devices, and much of that was social media use. And then finally, you think about the case studies, if you will, the many examples, hundreds, if not more, of circumstances where parents have reported that after being bullied on social media or harassed or exploited or extorted, that their child engaged in self-harm and in some cases took their own lives. I have actually sat with parents who have lost a child after they were harassed and bullied on social media. I've talked to parents who told me that when their child went through an emotionally difficult episode and perhaps posted about that the algorithm started feeding them more and more disturbing content, including walking them through how to take their own life as a solution to their pain. These are circumstances that should never happen. And here's the thing I would urge us to think about. Can you imagine if a medication for kids was put onto the market and let's say hundreds of children died after taking them, what would we do? Well, we would understandably pump the brakes. We'd say, we got to investigate and understand what is going on here. Who is being harmed by this? What are the circumstances under which harm is taking place? We would do that. And we do that actually all the time with medications. The thing that I find stunning and extremely disturbing is, why is it that of all the various things kids use, medications, car seats, cars when they get older, food, that we have been largely negligent in acknowledging the harms that are being reported day in and day out by parents and by kids themselves of social media. And we've responded with very little in the way of investigation, regulation, safety standards. That is actually a lot of what I called for last year in my advisory: real measures with teeth that Congress needs to pass to make social media safer. And the warning label is important, not as a solution to make social media safer, because it doesn't do that, but as a warning to parents to help them understand and to help kids understand what we are seeing increasingly in the data, that there isn't clear evidence of safety and that there is growing association between social media use and youth mental health harms.
Wonderful. So thank you. There's so much to unpack there. Warning labels for tobacco differ in a few ways. When I think of the literature on the harms from tobacco, we pretty well know from decades of research that tobacco is harmful. There's a litany of adverse health consequences that result from even a small amount of tobacco use. When I think about the literature on harms from social media, it is more an emerging literature. We understand there are some harms, but we don't know much about how much social media, in whom social media might be particularly dangerous. How do I think about a warning when we still have so much still to know about social media and its adverse consequences for teens?
Yeah. So this is a really important question. And I think it gets at what is often challenging about public health, which is sometimes you have to make decisions without 100% of all the information that you would want. And this is actually one of the reasons why I think we have to look at it in a real world context. If we're talking about trying to meet a threshold of, has every research question been answered? It'll take a long time to get there. And there's a cost to inaction. And in this work, unfortunately, the cost is often measured in lives lost. And so what we've got to do is understand, do we have enough information to act, right? There are plenty of circumstances where we recognize, a product may have benefit and also harm. And then we got to make a tough decision there, right? Tobacco is an interesting example where there really don't seem to be any redeeming benefits of tobacco. But think about opioid medications, for example, which we know have some benefits to treating pain, but we also know have substantial risks, right? In terms of, addiction. And many of us in medicine have seen that up front, living on the front lines of this, the opioid epidemic. So in this case, I think the decision that we have to make is to look at, again, number one, look at this from a safety first perspective and ask the question, do we have enough data to tell us this is safe? The lack of that data alone should be a red flag that should cause us to warn parents about the lack of data there, because many parents, like, rightly and understandably assume that because it's out there and free and available to use, that it must be safe, that somebody must have checked it out. And that's not the case. But the second thing that we've got to do is look at the accumulating evidence of harm, right? Are there open questions to answer? Absolutely. We want to know with greater detail and clarity which adolescents tend to benefit, which versus which ones are harmed. What particular types of use are beneficial versus what types of use are harmful? Are there times of the day where using social media seems to be better than other times of the day? Like, these are all important questions that would be great to be able to address. And that's why we got to invest more in research. Side note, it's also why we have to require data transparency from the companies themselves, because researchers tell me all the time they cannot get full access to the data that the platforms have on their impact on youth mental health. And that in my mind is highly problematic. I don't want to feel as a parent that the products my kids are using, that somehow the companies making them are hiding data from me about safety. That should be unacceptable. But in this case, I think that we have well passed that threshold, Because if we apply, again, the same principle to medications, we know there are plenty of medications that have benefits, but when we see evidence of harm crop up, we push the brakes, we investigate, we try to understand the origins of that. And even if it's a minority of people who are being harmed, if the harm is significant enough, a lot of times we will put restrictions on the medication, sometimes pull it entirely from the market. The threshold is not, are the vast majority of people being harmed by this drug? That is not the threshold that we use with other products, whether it's car seats, cars, whether it's food, whether it's nutrition, or medication. And keep in mind this too, just this year, this calendar year, we had a door plug come off a Boeing plane. Thankfully, nobody was killed. We grounded hundreds of planes to investigate. We had 2 people who died, after infection was detected in dairy products, listeria infection, right? Pulled countless numbers of dairy products from the shelf to investigate. We take these thresholds because we have rightly, as a society, said safety matters. And the peculiar thing to me is why we have not taken action here when we have far exceeded that threshold. In my mind, we have to think, I think, in a more nimble way about public health, about warning people about concerns when we see them. I know that there is sometimes a risk aversion to being wrong, to making a desire to make sure we've got an answer to every question before we act. This is, again, where I think that the mindset of clinicians becomes important in this conversation, because we know that the downside, the risk of not acting could be someone's life. If someone comes in, with plummeting blood pressures, who's febrile, and who's, got a rash that looks like cellulitis, I want to treat that as sepsis. I want to, get fluids in. I want to get antibiotics on board. I want to consider other types of shock as well, cardiogenic shock, anaphylactic shock, and perhaps treat those if I think there's a possibility. But I'm not going to wait 48 hours for the blood cultures to come back before getting antibiotics on board and getting fluids in, because the cost of that inaction could be someone's life. And so that's why here I think we've got to act now.
Well, what I appreciate also is that certainly saying there will be warning labels has gotten people's attention. It's gotten a lot of people talking about this issue. What I worry about, of course, is that now parents, patients are going to come to me, are going to come to other clinicians and ask, well, what should we do? So what practical advice do you give? And what practical advice can you help our clinicians with as they try to advise patients with regard to social media and its risks?
That's so important, and I'm glad you asked that question. I get a lot of these questions every day, like when I travel also, and so here's generally what I tell folks when it comes to your kids. One of the most important things you can do as a first step is to start having open conversations with them about social media's impact on their health and well-being. A lot of times our kids have great insights into how social media is making them feel, but they may not be expressing that to you. They also may not know when to raise a flag and say, hey, something is wrong here. But we want our kids to know if they're approached by strangers in ways that make them feel uncomfortable, as 6 out of 10 adolescent girls are on social media. Certainly if people are trying to bully or extort them or exploit them, that's an important time to raise a flag and to tell a parent. The second thing that's really important for us to do with our kids is to think about the timing of when we introduce social media into their lives. Now, I wish I could tell you there was an RCT out there that tested all the different ages and told us the best age. That doesn't exist. And we also know that kids differ in terms of their level of maturity and when they may be ready. I'll tell you, here's what my wife and I are planning to do for our kids and what I recommend to others. Number one is to wait until after middle school to consider using social media or giving your kid a social media account. Now, the reason for this is because adolescence, early adolescence in particular, is a unique phase of development where we know that children are more prone to being affected by social suggestion, social comparison, where their impulse control isn't as fully developed. We want to protect them during that time. And now I will say this is not easy, right? Very easy for me to say this, right? But what if you're the parent whose child is coming up to you and saying, everybody else has a social media account? Do you want me to be alone and left out? Like, I need to have one too. That's a very, very difficult circumstance to be in, which is why the other thing I recommend parents do is to actually talk to other parents and build partnerships around how to manage social media. If you have a few families that are all waiting until after middle school, that makes it a lot easier for you as a parent, but also your kid knows that they're not alone. One last thing I'd recommend, which is if your child is already on social media, is to consider creating tech-free zones in their days to protect specifically sleep, in-person interaction, and physical activity. One of the things I worry about with children is that social media use is robbing them of those critical areas that they need for healthy development. On average right now, adolescents are using social media for 4.8 hours a day. That's not all screen time. That is just social media, 4.8 hours a day. And that's gone up since when I actually issued the advisory last year. So these numbers are on the move and not in the right way. But the way to do this is you could say, for example, an hour before bedtime, we're all putting our devices in the kitchen and then we'll get them back in the morning. That helps protect quality and quantity of sleep. You could say meal times or social time when we're all together. That's going to be device-free time where we focus on talking to one another. So these are some steps I'd recommend for parents. And finally, if you're going to make that decision to delay, as my wife and I are going to make for our kids, I would reassess in high school based on their maturity, based on where the data is at that point about safety, and based on whether safety standards, the kinds that I've recommended in my advisory last year, have actually been put in place by Congress, because that's ultimately what we need to make social media safer for our kids. Maybe one last thing I will add for the clinicians out there who are seeing patients who have kids or who are seeing kids and engaging with their parents too, is I would encourage clinicians to raise the question with your patients about social media use, so you understand how it's making young people feel, but so that you're also having this conversation with parents. A lot of parents are actually living in a great deal of guilt and shame as they struggle to manage social media for their kids. They're not talking to other parents about it. They're assuming that other parents have figured this out because no one else seems to be having issues. At least nobody's posting about their concerns about it. And so many parents are having to manage a tech that they didn't grow up with that's rapidly evolving. And they feel like they're falling behind. And just having the opportunity to express this to a clinician, having the opportunity to know that they're not the only ones struggling, that can be immensely helpful to parents. And of course, any of the tips that we talked about today are ones that you can extend to your patients as well.
So we're creating those old-fashioned types of networks so that we can better understand how to combat these new digital networks.
That's right. We want to live in a world where social media augments our in-person interactions, not one where it completely substitutes for them. And that's ultimately what we need to get back to.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. You've gotten all of us talking about this very important issue, and I think that will hopefully prompt additional research as well as action, as you're suggesting, because this requires multiple layers of action to help us to think about how to use technology like this responsibly and in a way that protects our kids as well. So thank you, Vivek. I really appreciate you spending time to talk about this important issue, and thank you for all of the work that you're doing to draw attention to the health issues of the country.
Thanks so much, Kirsten. Glad we did this.
And to our audience, thank you for watching or listening to part 2 of our interview with Dr. Vivek Murthy. If you have not already, listen to part 1, where Dr. Murthy speaks about strategies to reduce firearm-related injuries in the United States. This episode was developed and researched by JAMA Associate Editor Dr. Yulin Swen and was produced by Patrick Lyle and Shelley Steffens at the JAMA Network. I'm Dr. Kirsten Bibbins Domingo. Subscribe to the JAMA Network YouTube channel and join us next time.